Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of Women Serve 2. Today we have Doris Sumner with us. She's a veteran of the Army, and if you are watching this on YouTube, she has her Vermont sweatshirt on because she's also a Vermont Army National Guard. So after serving 3 years active duty, she joined the Vermont National Guard. And she worked full time there for 33 years, predominantly in the human resources occupations. So the last 13 years, she has worked as the state equal employment and diversity manager. She was a senior GS level manager and a senior military officer as a chief warrant officer level 4. So she's received numerous state and federal awards, accumulating in the Legend of Merit upon her 2019 retirement. She served on the state and federal boards, committees, and councils. She served as the New England chair for the National Guard Bureau, Joint Diversity Executive Council, and later as the National Equal Employment Management Advisory Council. So this woman is clearly very, very well connected in the topic that we are going to be talking. So she's been in for multiple years. She even has her own book called Life at Camp, Combating the Sexism We Tolerate and Why the Military Should Take the Lead. So which is going to be the topic of today's episode. So besides that, she's also married to a combat vet. So that's something that we could probably dive into as well, being mill to mill. And she's raised 2 kids, has 3 grandchildren. So this woman is a very, very busy. So Doris, thank you so much for being on this episode.
Thanks for having me, Brittany. I do like the show, the podcast, all the episodes that you have. It's just amazing stories to listen to. And I think just reaffirm how strong women warriors are in what we've experienced and what we carry forward after we retire.
Yes. I'm reading your bio and I'm like, oh my God, I'm getting mumbled up. Your bio is so long, the words are so long. That's how you know you're super important, when the words just keep getting longer and longer. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm stumbling. But your bio is just so impressive. You've been in the military realm for 36 years. You're still extremely active. Tell us a little bit about your background.
I grew up in the country, and I was not a very good student. I was kind of a tomboy. I was kind of Rolling Stone, partier, and I met a recruiter in the bar, actually. And I think the Army really helped just slow down this role and get me focused. But I joined the Army at 18, and like I said, I didn't want an administrative job. I actually wanted to be like a Smokey and the Bandit character and learn how to drive truck, go cross country, and talk on the CB radio. I thought that would be a cool job. So I said, hey, will they teach me to drive trucks? And he was like, yeah, sure. So I joined the Army for 3 years active duty, and they sent me to training at Fort Dix, New Jersey. I went to basic training and my advanced individual training right there. And then after that, I got stationed at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. And I remember my brother kind of making fun of me. He's like, join the Army, travel the world. It's like they sent you down the East Coast. And he had joined the Air Force. They sent him to San Antonio, Texas, and then to Korea. And he's like, why didn't you join the Air Force? I was like, well, I wanted to be a truck driver. And he's like, well, they drive trucks in the Air Force too. But, it's like, okay. So anyway, yeah, so I did 3 years active duty. And then when I wasn't a good soldier. I wasn't disciplined. I was, again, I talk a lot about in my book about my alcoholism. I definitely was a partier and not taking life seriously. So I get out of the military and I divorced my first husband. Again, this is why I have a book. But anyway, I divorced my husband and he joined the Vermont National Guard. And I said, I'm going to join the Guard too. So I walk into the base camp thinking very confident that, I was a truck driver and I was prior service. And they were like, you don't want to be a truck driver. You'll be bored. We'll put you in the administrative company, Joint Force Headquarters. And they gave me the occupation, the MOS of, human resource. Handed me a typewriter back then in the day. And, I was in the personal service unit. And then the women that were in that unit were like, you can work full time for the guards. Cause I was going from job to job. And I walk on the base camp and I got a full-time job in 1987. And I drove through that base camp till 2019 when I retired. So my book appropriately called Life at Camp. I spent a lot of my life right there at Camp Johnson, certainly doing other things, but that's my military career. And I was mostly in the headquarters unit. the administrative unit and in the human resource field.
That's so crazy because in your bio, you did mention about, you recovering alcoholism. So did that affect your career at all?
I mean, I was 26 when I got sober. So literally,
Mm.
I got sober like the first year I was at Camp Johnson. And I qualified early on in my young years. I drank a lot of beer. And yeah, I was introduced to recovery from a boyfriend, was very codependent too. So I believe I wouldn't have, and I had so many different jobs, and my mom was always worried about me, you know. And I think she was relieved when I landed at Camp Johnson and I got sober because it was the anchor. It was the anchor for me to stay, even when it was challenging, and grow up and mature and figure out, you know, what I was going to do with the talents that were bestowed upon me. So in that way, recovery impacted my career, you know, but I probably could have done a lot better active duty if I wasn't so active in my drinking. But I was just, like I said, not disciplined. So I actually threw all my uniforms away at the last day that I ETS from the Army. Threw them away. So I'm never going to wear a uniform again. I'm out of here. And then, you know, I had friends from early on from my first duty station, and they're like, God, I can't believe you ended up a Chief Warrant Officer 4, spending 36 years because you were just such a partier and not a disciplined soldier. And I outlasted most of them.
But that's amazing, right? Like, especially at a early age, right? Our brains don't develop until 25, and here you are making that decision at 26. And like that's huge. And it takes like a lot of like self-discipline and kind of like a self journey to make that sobriety journey. So I give you complete kudos for that. And like you said, you were in for like 36 years. So let's talk about like a little bit about that long-term experience. You said that you were in human resources. So how was your long-term experience in the National Guard, and more specifically those 13 years as an equal opportunity occupation, kind of provide you that unique perspective regarding military sexual trauma for warriors, since that's essentially the topic that we're trying to discuss today?
I mean, that is my passion. I was in the military. I joined the Army. I was a truck driver. I was partying with the guys. I assimilated to the Army culture, to the boy culture, to the masculine warrior identity. You know, I put my bravado on and I was successful. And then I joined the Guard, and they had me be in administrative unit. And what I was impressed with in the unit was all the women, because I never had a lot of women friends. And, you know, I bonded with my women comrades. Where I want to go with this. But then as I worked in human resources, I eventually became the state equal employment manager. That's the person that processes discrimination cases. And so as my career is going, working full time for the Guard, I'm putting on a uniform every day. I'm going to drill. And of course, I'm in a headquarters unit, so we're not doing combat exercises or anything like that. Our weekend drills are administrative duties, you know, and we have to go to the range once a year and qualify. We have to do our PT test. But other than that, there was no combat training in the headquarters unit. So I had a pretty good gig, you know, as far as that goes. But then when I became the equal opportunity officer, the first woman that came into my office from maintenance and started describing the crap that she was putting up with regard to being disrespected, being undermined, sexist jokes, just disrespected in these awful ways. There was like sweat running down my back, because it was just like, here I had been in 22 years. I was 40 years old. And although I had experienced sexual harassment right from the get-go, and I had experienced sexual assault too in my first duty station, I experienced things, but I just didn't really, I put them in my backpack and I moved on. So, you know, you just kind of shoulder that kind of stuff. But when I became the advocate for these women and she's telling me the story, I don't know, I just had a physiological, psychological change. I was like, holy shit, I'm in a sexist organization. And this woman's describing this situation, and I'm the manager responsible to go to her leadership and resolve this workforce hostile environment that she was describing. And although she eventually did drop that case and ended up getting out on a medical, that was my first exposure to what my job was. I just kind of morphed into the job. And then, so for those 13 years, it was not only unpacking my own experiences being in a male dominated type of organization, but it was hearing women warriors coming to me with that humiliation, with that resignation of being not respected fully as their male counterparts. And I became very involved in trying to make it right. And I think because I was in recovery, because I was sober, because I took a purpose-filled, like every day that I'm sober, I say, God wants me sober for a reason. There's something that this higher power needs me to do. And so I took it very personal. Whereas other equal opportunity officers, although they were passionate, I don't think they became as attached to the problems as I did. And so, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying that's what happened to me. Mm-hmm. And so for the 13 years that I was having women, and I became known as the place to go to even just vent, just to unload, just to get validated. My office was like the safe haven where women would come and tell me what it was like to, be at a staff meeting with all guys and not be heard, or put out ideas and then have it put down. But then when Tim says it, oh, Tim's great. And just that whole humiliation of working where feminine was not as equally respected as the masculine point of view. And so that, to me, I feel like really motivated me to want to fix it, because I came in, my recruiter was sexually harassing me, pretty much trying to sexually assault me. And then my first company commander sexually assaulted me. And I put those so deep in my backpack that when women were expressing these things to me, I was like, that happened in 1982. And here it is 2005, 2010, 2013, whatever year it was, that sexism, even though they say the military is getting better, there's more women, sexism still hurts. It doesn't matter if it's 1981 or 2019 or 2024. Being disrespected based on your gender and then being humiliated, whether physically or verbally, it's a horrible thing. And especially when women want to be so good at their job and they love what they do and they love taking care of soldiers, or they love logistics or whatever field they're in, and they just want to do their job. So yeah, I think that my 13 years hearing all these, it wasn't just my pain. It was this collection of pain. And not only in Vermont, but as you were kind of spelling out all those acronyms, I was the National Equal Employment Management Advisory Council. I was on these national boards. So I was getting data, not just from Vermont, but all across the National Guard, the type of climate that the Guard warriors were working in. And yes, there's racial problems and there's discrimination based on religion or sexual orientation. But the predominant discrimination was on gender, on the masculine, feminine class that we were in. And so I could go on and on.
That's so crazy. Like, because you were saying, your recruiter was doing it. So at that point, I probably wouldn't even joined, or I would have found maybe a different recruiter. Like, I know you mentioned that you kind of rolled it off your back, but what made you keep it more closer to home in the beginning of your career?
I was naive country girl from Vermont, the cover of my book, The Woman Embarking on This Journey, when I think of that image, I think of this young 18-year-old that got on that Greyhound bus. Like, I had no idea what kind of challenges that I was going to meet. And so each time I faced, like, even with the recruiter being handsy with me and everything, it was just the thought, I'm headed to what I want to do. And I want to join the Army, and I'm not going to let you stop me. So it was like, yeah, you put it in the backpack and you drive on. And I wrote that in my book too. I just couldn't wait to get rid of this recruiter and get on the bus. But, the thought of it's going to happen again did not come in my mind. And as far as being sexually assaulted by my commander, I write in the book, it wasn't a violent assault like that. It was, I'm drunk. He asked me out. I don't really want to go with him, but hey, he's the commander. He's like, oh, come on, I'll show you Baltimore, Oh, I got to stop by my apartment, and I don't want to go in all the details, but I just kind of said, well, I took as part of my, I shouldn't have gone with him. I shouldn't have been drinking. So I kind of owned that and not really see him. And I talked to some of my guy friends, my buddies there, and they were just like, oh, he's retiring soon. he's getting done like in 2 weeks. So they became very protective of me after that. But there was back then, there was no, oh, go tell the sexual assault response coordinator or report him. It was just like, okay, we'll protect you. And so they took on this more protective role and helping me. Being in a very, very male dominated business, there was probably only 3 other females in my unit at that time. This was back in 19.
So you also said that, your office ended up being like the safe haven, and then more women were coming forward. As you kind of progressed in your career field, did you feel like more women were able to come forward?
During my 13 years, and still today, the studies will show, yeah, there's an increase of reporting, okay? But the underrepresentation of the incidences is still wicked. There's a lot of people just kind of shouldering disrespect, shouldering sexual harassment. So yes, there was more women. And I think even today, and I've been out 5 years, there are more young women saying, hey, that's not okay. And feeling confident in going to the equal opportunity officer, going to their leadership and saying, this is what happened, and then moving forward from there. The issue is that the prevalence remains the same. So, okay, there's more reporting, there's more processing of discrimination on sexual harassment. There's more reporting of sexual assaults and that whole process of adjudication. But once the act has happened, that's where the whole bias and the whole male majority and the androcentric, like it's 90% men, 80% men, but in some units, it's 99% men in the leadership. And I think about, because it's Breast Cancer Awareness Month, it's October. Most people who are very, very active in the cure for cancer have been personally impacted by it. And so they're very, very passionate about solving that problem, that issue, that awful thing. And with regard to sexual assault, it happens to men too. So it happens to men and women. But for the women in the military, to take it to the male leadership, when men have been socialized not to talk about it, right? Just to bury whatever personal experiences they may have had with sexual violence. And so there's not enough people who are so passionate about fixing something that's not personally impacting them. There were so many good men, good leaders that I worked for that I spent a lot of time trying to convince how important it would be for them to be champions. And oftentimes their pride or even their pain would keep them more silent about the problem and just want the problem to go away, not really solve it, but just want the problem to go away. So yeah, that was disheartening. It was, and again, I have the book that I have is a big book, 622 pages, and it would be 2,000 pages if I didn't have an editor. But yeah, and she never spent any time in the military. So she really helped me articulate this type of culture that women are working in. And I say women a lot, but it does impact men too. My husband was not a bro. Okay. He's a combat guy. He was mechanic and he was in an infantry unit. He was in logistics, but he wasn't one of the guys. And it impacted his career too, because he did care about all his soldiers. But then you have those macho who care about the boys, who mentor the boys, who disregard the feminine. And so this culture is it's like a wave that you can't stop. Mm-hmm. That's what it felt like. It felt like the waves kept coming and I just couldn't stop the waves. So
we know everything starts from the top down, right? Especially with leadership and how leadership makes a proposal or does something and it trickles down. So with that being said, I mean, you talked about those numerous studies that summarize that military culture. I mean, it's male dominated. It's very masculine as the predominant factor in these high prevalence, sex-based offenses. So let's start big picture first. How do you think, or how do you propose the DoD impact the change that we need to see? And then to follow up on that, what can lower level leadership managers do?
Oh, I wanted to say this morning, I was looking through the bins that I have kept, the bins of research, reports, data, okay, on how male-dominated, let me just see this here, male-dominated cultures have a higher prevalence of sex-based crimes. That's just a fact, right? If there's more men, there's an increase in this sex-based crime, even against men. And so it seems like the logical answer would be to increase the representation of women in the military. But it's like, again, it's kind of telling, it was me going to the leadership, the all-male leadership. They were the sergeant majors, the colonels, the brigade commanders, the adjutant generals, saying if you had more women, we'd have less sex-based crime. Well, yes, we want more women. But how do you get more women in a sexist organization? So that was the rabbit cage that I was running around in. And this morning, there is this 1997 Secretary of the Army report on sexual harassment after the Aberdeen Proving Ground scandal in 1996. So if anybody's old enough or you want to research it, but in 1996, there were 12 drill instructors that were charged with sex crimes. 4 were sentenced to prison, 8 were discharged, and numerous other drill sergeants got letters of reprimand. This was only 8 years before I was the SEAM. So when I became the SEAM, it had only happened 8 years ago. This awful thing, this awful scandal. And it took another 10 years before Vermont National Guard had a sexual assault response coordinator. So, all these things are going on. And what I want to say here is the executive summary of the crux of the problem. So they did this study. What is the problem? What happened here? And they did this big study, right? And they talk a lot about all the measurements and the different ways and all the different bases that they went to get all this data to come up with this executive summary and conclusion. So I just want to read this conclusion. I don't want to go on and on, but the conclusion is that the human relations environment is the problem. Okay, when you think about that, the human relations is the people, the human relations, right? And so they were going on and on about all the recommendations of the EO, and they kept saying leaders are responsible for the human relations, okay? Nobody says in all these reports that I've studied over the years is who are the leaders? Well, the leaders are predominantly men, okay? And so the leaders are responsible for the culture. But yet, even when we have women representation, which does matter, we didn't have enough diversity in the power corps. So if you had one female brigade commander and 3 other male brigade commanders, yeah, she was strong. Yeah, she earned her place there. Yes, she had a strong voice to advocate for her brigade or whatever. But there wasn't enough to really influence the entire brigade because she had male first sergeants, male command sergeant majors, male platoon sergeants, So I just talk about how the military since 1997, when they recognized this awful cultural human relations problem, they have taken 24, 30 years, and we still have the same problem. And a lot of it is because what I wanted to say in my book, what I advocated for, I wanted to shout from the rooftops, is if the answer is to increase the representation of diversity, why aren't we doing it? And so they say, oh, yeah, we want more women. But you can look at studies and studies and studies and see, even in recruiting and the marketing, and they're doing a little more now, showing women on the covers and in the articles and in the commercials. But for a long time, it's always been their marketing has been trying to entice men, masculine, bravado guys to come into the military and make it strong. And so they're just now, it's been 30 years since Aberdeen, they're just now trying to rebrand the marketing to entice women to come. And that's what I was saying in all of my work. I talk about gender equality accountability. I talk about the gender report because, yes, every Department of Defense agency has an equal opportunity report that they have to send up, and it spells out the representation of men and women and race and national origin, ethnicity, but there's no sanctions. So I was sending up these reports year after year, and it was one of my adjutant generals said, Doris, where's all the women? All my commanders, all my sergeant majors, they're all men. Where are all the women? How come they're not in these positions? And I took his question to heart. I was like, yeah, why don't we have more women first sergeants? And when we did our study, when we did our out and abouts and our climate assessments, and we look at the sexual harassment cases and how they were processed, we came up with the same thing that this report in 1997. It's the culture. It's a very male, bravado, gender biased culture. When women, so let me just give an example. And I try to say this to the sergeant majors, I have a whole chapter about sergeant majors, but when a female platoon sergeant is leading her troops and she is acting just like a guy, using foul language, trying to be aggressive, trying to be assertive, get the effing boxes in the truck on the double, she gets a bad performance appraisal. Tim, when he acts that way, he gets a positive performance. And these sergeant majors say, no, that's not true. And I'm like, I can show you the data and I can have women testify that when they try to be masculine, like their brothers who are getting promoted, because they're like, well, how do you get promoted? You act like Tim, right? Then they would get punished for that. So there was this status gap, right? And so that's why, I guess I'm kind of rambling here, but that's why women were not, if you can't get platoon sergeant, if you can't get respect for being a platoon sergeant, why would you apply to be first sergeant? So a lot of these platoon sergeants, they did their tour and they'd be like, I'm sick of being disrespected, getting bad performance ratings, and then when I'm doing the same thing that Tim was doing and more, right? And so they would just resign from pursuing. Now, there were a lot of super women who would jump leaps and bounds and become sergeant majors, command sergeant majors. And I think most would attest that they worked twice as hard to achieve the same rank position that their male counterparts did, because having to work through that gender bias and having to prove themselves over and over again. So we did a lot of diversity trainings on gender and just, again, this tiny little state of Vermont and small few people, 15 people come to the group. But we had such powerful revelations from some of these men who were like, I didn't even realize my bias and how I was treating, you less than this other guy and not respecting you the same. Because a lot of our bias is unconscious, it's unintentional, but yet it's still there. And so that's why in my book, what I tried to promote was accountability to increase the representation, because you can send up all these EO reports, but the military can't go out of business. It's going to get funded because we can't go out of business. We can't go on a leave, right? It's like, and because we do get the job done, even with all the bias, even with all the sexual harassment, sexual assault, we get the job done. But the cost of getting the job done is this high prevalence of sexual assault. 1 in 4 women, and 1 in 8 men are going to experience some form of unwanted sexual contact during their career. And as a parent, if your kid wanted to go work for a company that had that sort of reputation, you probably wouldn't want them to go there. And so they talk about the recruiting shortfalls, and there's evidence to show that if you know of an organization that has a high prevalence of sexual harassment, the underrepresented, the people that are most getting harassed, are not going to apply. And there are women going to the recruiters and joining and having a great career and finding success and have not experienced sexual assault or sexual harassment or gender bias. That doesn't take away from the fact there's so many that are experiencing that. So it's been a lonely journey to call out, especially Vermont National Guard, but Vermont National Guard is no worse or better. Actually, I think it's a little better, but than other National Guards for sexism. But it's been a lonely journey, because it seems like I'm anti-military or I didn't have a good career. I had a great career. I love the military. Like I said, it brought discipline to my life. It brought purpose to my life. But there's so many warriors that came to me, and I write a lot of some of their stories in the book, that I feel we really missed out on their talent and on what they could have been. So, yeah, I'm sorry. I can go on and on.
No, so one of the things that makes me think about, so Chief Bass from the Air Force, so she was the first female chief of the Air Force, and she made a post actually very recently on LinkedIn where the comments that she would get, and even to this day, she's retired now. She retired earlier this year. I mean, don't exactly quote me on when she retired, but she just got out and she's still getting comments on her career advancement. Like, most of her career was probably on her back or on her knees and stuff like that. How, for the women who are listening and dealing with these comments, what advice would you tell them in order to continue, just not to let that bother you, right? Honestly, in one of my podcasts on YouTube, a comment was made, they said, I can't stand women like you. Why can't men just have one job or have one thing? Why don't you go make a sandwich? And it bothered me. And then I was like, why is this still a thing? So for women who are still in, what is your advice to not let that get to them and to keep trying to progress and have a very successful career?
And I've heard so many powerful, strong, competent women on your episode talk about their careers and, that resilience and that grit to just keep going, and to brush off a lot of those remarks, and just not give them power, right? I think that's where I want to fix it, because it's unfair that we should have to also be competent warriors and manage sexism. Like, that's double duty right there, where guys just got to be competent warriors, and I guess, like I said, that's why I think it's important that we all of us, both men and women and warriors and people invested in our military, call it out. We've got to combat the sexism, this disparate treatment, because one person identifies as feminine or as a female, and somebody identifies as a male. Like, I'm a warrior, and I don't like the whole thing. It doesn't matter if you're male or female. It doesn't matter if you're white or black or whatever. I think our identity is really personal and really important. And then if I identify as female, I do want to be seen as a female warrior. But what I want to be seen as first as a human, as a competent warrior. And so I guess, for those that are listening, it's hold the military accountable for the values that it says that we have a bedrock on of dignity and respect. And I had some men in the diversity classes that we were having, or prevention of sexual harassment. And they were like, why do we need these? We have the Army core values. And I'm like, well, how is it respectful? Okay, that a senior sergeant would come up behind one of his female sergeants. She's looking out the window, and he whispers in her ears, you make me horny. How is that senior sergeant living the Army values in any way, shape, or form? Because it happens. And, it's just like, yes, we have these values of respect and dignity and selfless service and courage and everything, but we're humans, that human relation. There's something about that person who feels entitled and privileged that they could say that without any accountability, because it just happens a lot. It just these terms that are going around. So it's easy for me to say at 61 and retired, and even when I was in as a senior chief, it's easy for me to say, tell somebody, hold them accountable, file a report. And I got to tell you, I was 50 years old, and I was transferred to the Recruit Sustainment Program company to be the executive officer for that company. And I was reading, all my diversity stuff and everything. And the first weekend that I'm in that unit, I am hearing faggot, gay, and pussy, and I'm hearing all kinds. They kind of know who I am, that I'm the equal opportunity officer. I've been around a long time, but I was transferred into this unit, and I felt intimidated to turn around and say, hey, that's inappropriate. I'm new to the unit. I want them to like me. I want them to respect me. I don't want to start off on the wrong foot. And so the whole weekend, I was having this cognitive dissonance, like, I'm the EO officer. I'm a feminist. I'm promoting diversity. And I'm hearing a lot of it, like I said, it's joking around, they're unconscious, but it's still, if my son was in that unit, and my son's not gay, but if he was a gay person in that unit mopping the floor, I don't know how many times I heard them say gay faggot, okay, in a demeaning way. Would he feel comfortable saying that doesn't make me feel safe if a 50-year-old warrant officer can't say it? So it's easy for me to say, find somebody to tell, report it, hold them accountable, give them pushback when they're inappropriate. But what I want to say to leadership, it shouldn't be the private giving pushback. It shouldn't be the underrepresented person giving pushback. It should be the leadership setting the example and saying, we don't tolerate that kind of language in the unit. Think about what you're saying. So that's what I say to anyone listening, is check in on your people. Do you feel safe here? And when they share with you that they don't feel safe, they don't feel respected or valued, do something about it. Don't just say, oh, I'll go talk to him and then have your little bro talk, and it still continues. Like, hold that person accountable. If I hear of another report of you saying disparaging comments about gay people, this is what's going to happen, because we can't have it, because that soldier is worthy of a respectful, safe environment. And, you know, if you can't live the Army values of respect, then we're going to hold you accountable. But it's just, that's the everyday stuff that goes on in units, you know, from small, short squadrons to brigades in the highest levels. And it's tough to round everybody up around that.
Yeah, I agree, because like I know, you know, kind of we're talking about different groups now at this point, right? Like gays or blacks and women. So like affirmative action, right? So what would you say to the leaders that do say that they have tried affirmative action and it doesn't work, and that it actually, you know, kind of hurts the fact of, you know, the advancement of those people?
I was becoming the equal opportunity officer, when I got into my job and I'm looking through the cupboards and all the files and everything, they had these affirmative action plans, and I'm reading the affirmative action plans. And by law, each state Department of Defense entity had to have an affirmative action plan. But these plans were so big, and so there was no teeth to them. There was no accountability to them. That's why that general said to me, "Where's all my women?" Because year after year, I would send him the EO report and the affirmative action report, and the numbers would stay the same. And so I think, why isn't it working? It's because the people, like I said, who were entrusted with carrying out the plans didn't have a vested interest in them working, in them actually changing. And so what I talk about in my book and the work that I did during my tenure was the gender report. I focused just on gender because I felt like gender crosses all forms of diversity, whatever your sexual orientation is, your race, your ethnicity, everybody has a gender identity. Okay. And it was the predominant factor in the discrimination cases was sex-based, gender-based issues. And so the gender report, what we were trying to show, okay, was there was a lot of women coming in, 25% of the recruits were women. And as the rank went up, the representation went down. And we were trying to show that if you want to change the culture, you need to change the representation. And so we need to mentor, we need to put women in the pipeline, we need to mentor them, we need to encourage them, we need to create policies that have women wanting to stay. And you can have all these policies like the combat exclusion rule that got abolished so women can go into combat and go into the infantry occupations. But if you don't change the culture, women are not going to want to do that. So affirmative action is accountability for not making progress. And certainly we can't put the military out of business, but there has to be some form of accountability for not making progress. And so I guess, like I said, affirmative action plans, they didn't work because the people that were in charge of the affirmative action plans didn't want them to work, you know? And so what we need is affirmative action plans for sure, or we can rebrand it or something. Maybe there's too many triggers on affirmative action plan term, but it's basically being held to make a difference in your representation and really putting some effort into that. And so how do you do that when you still have this unconscious bias? It's all around us. I think younger people are more attuned to being less biased. I don't know how, I guess it's kind of backwards in saying, I think younger people don't have that natural bias that men are superior to women. But I think that the boomers, right, the people that have been around a long time, because you ask anybody who's been to combat, they don't care what your race is or what your gender is. If you were competent and you had their back and you were doing your job, you know, you had their respect. And so I think, like I said, we just need some way for the Department of Defense to hold the military accountable to actually make improvements. And every year when I see the new report and I see the representation very, very, very slowly, it's been the same for decades, the representation of women. And it's just like, because they're not being held accountable to actually rebrand the military from the boys' club, from the men's club, from the masculine warrior identity. And in corporate America, when they're not making money, something's got to change. So every quarter they're looking at their profit margin, right? Their profit. And they're like, okay, we got to rebrand. We've got to market so we can get sell our products to those people who want it. But in the military, year after year, decade after decade, our recruiting, that's our profit margin. And our recruiting keeps going down, but yet we're not changing the brand. And the brand needs to go from masculine to, non-gender related identity, just a warrior identity, full warrior identity. That would be my hope, is that, it's not enough to just to have a campaign for a couple of months or to have an effort when something tragic, like Vanessa Guillen's awful tragedy that happened. And then there's a lot of attention around it, and then it just dies down. Mm-hmm. And we just do business as usual. And we need our military, and I say, when people say thank you for your service, I really take that to heart, because when you say, I will, even as a naive country girl saying, I'll go downrange, embarking on that Greyhound bus, it's a big deal. Not really knowing where the Army or the military, the Navy, where they're going to send you. You just say, I'll do it. And you sign the line and you go to training. And then after training, they send you wherever they want. That's a big deal. And so, yeah, we need to hold the military accountable for what it says it's going to do, what they're going to do.
So on like the unit level, what can leaders do now to kind of change that culture?
I think don't disregard diversity training. There's a lot of, DEI is getting a lot of bad rap for it. But when we take the time to invest in looking how we operate, and just having that invested time, whether it's an hour or it's a couple hours, where you're all sitting around and you're talking about your biases and how to counteract them. And I do diversity training. I just did diversity training at a salon, and there was 10 women who came to the diversity training. So first of all, the owner of the salon taking the time to ask their employees to do this. And you would think that women in a salon wouldn't get sexually harassed. They do. And so we were talking about, it's really hard to set a boundary when your clients, you want a good review from your clients, right? And you have to feel kind of safe, safe enough to say, hey, that's, you're crossing the line, or I don't feel comfortable with you talking like that, or you're getting a little bit too close. And they're up close personal with their clients. So it was a great conversation about how to set a boundary around taking care of yourself and self-respect. And in the military, when unit commanders invest, and it's hard, it's really hard, but get the professionals, facilitators. And this is what I did while I was in my tenure. We'd have these, they call them lean-in groups. We'd have these lean-in sessions, and we would just talk about bias and how it shows up, and then support each other on how to set a boundary to protect ourselves, to have self-respect, and bring awareness. And like I said, a lot of the examples where people were like, I didn't even realize I was doing that. And then we'd hear such positive things after it. So I think that what unit leaders can do is don't be afraid to invest in just taking some time to talk about our human relations. I mean, even in our families, we can have a hard time getting along with family. So when you're spending this time, especially in the military, where it's hard work, and we, if we have to go downrange, go to combat, it's so important that we know how to mesh and trust each other. And so invest in a little bit of time about who I am, what, how my bias shows up, because we all have bias. It doesn't make us bad. Just like that's the way we're socialized. And, I was a white girl from Vermont. I had never gone to school or worked with Black people in my life until I got to basic training. And so I just was unconscious, really, of my perceptions of people from a different background until I was exposed to them and had opportunity to work with different people. So I think that's what I'd ask unit leaders to do, is don't diss DEI, because it's so important that we just spend a little bit of time. I relate it back to family. Mm-hmm. In your family, if you're having siblings that are having this conflict and it keeps coming back, the same conflict that they're having, you usually have a family meeting or a mediation because you're trying to resolve the conflict. What's going on? And I know my husband and I were both military, and our neither one of our kids are in the military, but we had family meetings every week. We had a family meeting, and if anybody had an issue, they put it on the refrigerator, and then that's a family meeting. We try to resolve it. What is the crux of this issue? Just an example is my daughter would say that her brother kept going in her room and she's, because she didn't have a lock on her door. Anyway, then we said, what's the solution? Well, we're going to have to put a lock on the door if Troy's not going to respect your room, your privacy. So anyway, again, back to unit level. I also want to bring up terms, words. When you do that diversity training, a lot of times we're not realizing people say you guys all the time. And I read a lot about this in my book too. You guys comes from the masculine. It's a masculine word. And if we were to say you gals and there was men in the room, they'd be like, I'm not a gal. But women just say, okay, I know you mean me too. We just let it go. But I think terms are really important. The words that we're using impact. And I'll tell this story too. I had a brigade commander. I used to preach the whole you guys thing a lot. And I had a brigade commander was getting ready to go on deployment in Afghanistan, had a big group of his unit there. And he actually said from the podium, I'm not going to use the word you guys because I have women in my unit. You warriors, we're going to go downrange. We're going to be successful. And he just, said that at the beginning of his speech. And I had so many females come up to me and say, oh my God, I felt so heard. I felt so respected. Just that one comment that he made, just acknowledging, because it's so easy just to throw out the guys. And anyway, so that brigade commander was just very well respected. And I appreciated the fact that he kind of got that from my classes, right? So, and he told me that too,
That's awesome. So
that's what they can do.
Obviously shows like the impact that your training has done. Like, it always starts, like I said earlier, it starts from leadership going down. I mean, we could try to go up, but right, like we also kind of talked about like the repercussions of not getting promoted and not being liked. And I think it is easier to do top down instead of bottom up.
That example, just being an inclusive leader, it's not just a term. It's actually how you, like I said, how you talk, how you articulate, how you listen, how you validate. It's kind of like parenting too. I relate that a lot too, because sergeant majors, of course, I'm a boomer. I was born in 1963 and I was in from 1981 to 2019. So a lot of the sergeant majors were my age, right? And they almost rebelled and were prideful in the way that they were raised in the military, of the in your face, suck it up. The Army didn't give you feelings, didn't issue you feelings. Don't be a crybaby and all this toughness. Even my husband very much thrived on that. But I was like, just because it worked for you during your generation doesn't mean that you could take that and it's going to serve you well with the new generation of young people coming up, because we ourselves parented differently than our parents parented us. So a lot of sergeant majors would try that old, tough, crusty old sergeant major and wonder why these kids were getting out or not performing well. It was like, why do you try to be a little different? And there are some really, a lot of parents out there who have adopted new ways of parenting because the way that they were parented didn't serve them well. And so I think that same goes with leadership. It's like some things that might have worked for you and motivated you, it may not work for the people that you're leading now.
Yeah. Continuing education, continuing leadership education. So what advice would you give to listeners, both veterans and civilians, like interested in joining the military or know someone who could benefit from joining the military?
Well, I want to say that I was just doing a book talk. My book, it's called Life at Camp, Combating the Sexism We Tolerate and Why the Military Should Take the Lead. And I was just having a book talk, and there was a woman about my age who read the book, and she said, I was kind of alarmed at the sexism and the sexual harassment stuff that was happening in the military. And then I saw a commercial on the TV, Vermont National Guard women talking about how great the military was, what a great career it was, and they were parents. And she goes, I thought to myself, are they telling the truth? And I was like, yes, they are telling the truth, because the Guard is good. And there's a lot of great benefits. Yeah, and there's camaraderie, and there's, you do this hard work and it just stays with you forever, and discipline and all the stuff that the military brought to my life. They are telling the truth, but it doesn't take away that there are some dysfunctions. And again, relating it to your family, there's some things in our family, habits or trends or whatever, that aren't healthy and could be change, to make things better. And that's what I'm saying about the military. The military is great. I love the military. We need the military. We need more women in the military. We need more women in leadership positions. And so they're not lying when they say it's great. But when you come in, you shouldn't have to be a competent warrior and manage the bias that we're socializing ourselves into, that somehow masculine is superior to feminine. Like, that is what we need to really focus on, that we see each other as equals based on our competency, based on how we're performing and how we're being a warrior, a selfless warrior. So I'm hoping that anybody out there that's listening would consider reading my book, because I have had women in the Guard read it and say, I wish I would have had this book before I joined, or before I became a sergeant first class, because a lot of the problems start to exist when you're competing for power, when you're competing for leadership roles, because men and women approach leadership from a culturally different way, just based on American society and the way that men and boys and girls are raised. We know there's this gender bias, and it's improving, but it's real slow. So when they get into the military, at first we're all the privates, we're all partying together, we're all working together, there's no problem, we're all buddies. Then you want to be the platoon sergeant, you want to be the squad leader, and so you start performing to get recognized. And again, like I was saying earlier, the female that's acting the same as the male, she's got to, if she's all female, if she's all herself, if she's being true to who she is, she's getting punished for it. She's not getting recognized for it. And then she's disheartened. So that's where we need to help embrace what feminine brings to the force. All of the feminine attributes that women have, and we know from female engagement teams in the combat zones, but also just women tend to have a higher level of empathy and emotional intelligence and connecting with humans, not because men are bad, but because men have been socialized to suck it up and don't show feelings and don't show emotions and push it all down, and which is unhealthy for them. So we just have a lot of work to do, just like that 1997 report said, in human relations. Mm-hmm. All right. When we're all synchronized, when your family unit is synchronized on being successful, then you're successful. When you're all working together. And yeah, I think that with regard to military sexual trauma, which is a phenomenon, and there's so much harm that lasts forever. There are female veterans that are carrying trauma from 30 years ago. What my book talks about is unpacking that backpack trauma of humiliations, of sorrow, of regrets, and finding peace in the journey that you took. And that's what happened to me through the writing process, is I unpacked a lot of that pain, not only my own pain, but pain from hearing from others that, I don't want to give away the ending, but towards the ending of my book, I'm okay. I'm okay with what I was able to contribute during my trudge. And that's what I want warriors to experience when they read the book, is to find a place to unload that pain or sorrow or regrets regarding the gender bias that blocked you from becoming all that you could be, and make it better for the next round of warriors that are saying, I'll go downrange. I'll do it.
Where can someone find your book? Is it on Amazon? Is it in stores? Like, do you have a website where people could buy it off of?
Well, it is available on Amazon or any bookstores. I self-published it, and so it's available. And I'm getting ready to launch my audiobook, so it's available Kindle and print right now. My audiobook should be coming out in a few weeks. But if you Google, it's all Life at Camp, Doris Sumner, or you go to my website, it's all about ego.com. As I did, the It's All About Ego is my website, because I started a business around talking about gender bias and diversity, and really looking at the gender bias that shows up. Like I was telling you about that workshop I did at a salon. It was pretty eye-opening. I did not realize that. Of course, I've never worked with people who work in a hairdressing spa salon, it's like, wow. So it's been an interesting journey looking at different landscapes, different workforce landscapes. But I haven't found a profession that has said, we don't have a problem with sexism. We don't have a problem with sexual harassment. Like, I haven't found it, whether it's lawyers or even Dunkin' Donuts, it's all around us, and we can all do a little bit. So it's all about ego.com, and my book is Life at Camp. And I really thank you for allowing me an opportunity to talk about what I tried to do during my tenure and what I'm trying to do now.
I love your mission. I appreciate you so much for taking the time to share your expertise and your insights. Like, I didn't think about certain things, like how relating leadership to parenting was almost kind of eye-opening for me, right? So, like, hearing different perspectives, I think, is really good. And I think we need to continue to obviously have these conversations. So, people hopefully are open-minded, can see where they can self-grow and self-develop. And hopefully, they go get your book and read about this journey that you have and how it shaped your life and shaped what you're doing now.
Yeah, I think about that one brigade commander, just that one comment that he made. And there was so many women who they just felt so good about it. And it was just one little sentence that he said.
Yeah.
So you can make a difference.
It really is. Sometimes it really is the small things, right? Like, some people think it needs to be this big, massive overhaul, but starting with small, it just, like that little pebble in the lake, it'll slowly ripple. Well, Doris, thank you so much for taking the time today to do this episode with us. Please, everyone, check out her website and get her book. I will put it in the show notes so it's easy access for you guys. Until next time, we will talk to you then.